You were never meant to hear this, and yet here you are drawn to a name whispered like a curse in the hollows of the Missouri Ozarks. The year is 1912, and the earth itself seems to hold its breath as wagons creak past a crooked farmhouse where a woman waits with a smile that hides 1,000 shadows. Her name is Eliza Whitlock, and in the first 8 seconds of this story, you should feel the pull of something older and darker than law, a secret sealed in blood and silence. The road that leads to her house is lined with oak and sycamore, twisted by storms, and rumor travelers speak of a strange hush when they approach a chill that slides over their skin, like cold fingers in daylight. The Whitlock place looks humble, but at night, it takes on a shape of its own lantern light leaking through warped windows, like the eyes of a creature waiting to feed, and yet no one dares to name it aloud, because to name is to summon, and to summon is to risk being taken inside. I am not here to tell you a folk tale. I am here to show you the hidden layers that the county ledgers, the court records, and the church sermons tried to erase. Eliza was no simple widow, no gentle innkeeper. She was a practitioner of something forbidden, a keeper of an old hunger carried across the Atlantic from secret societies that believed sacrifice could twist fate itself. She wrapped that hunger in charity and tea and soft words, and for a time, even the sheriffs and pastors dined at her table, believing they were safe, believing she was one of them. As you step with me across her threshold, you will feel the boards under your feet and the low vibration of voices just beyond the edge of hearing. She invited the lost, the weary, the debt-ridden, and the desperate, and they came like moths to a flame, unaware that the water she offered held more than the reflection of the moon. This is the beginning of a descent, not just into a crime, but to a ritual of control, a map of hidden power drawn in suffering and secrecy. And if you keep listening, you will begin to see patterns in your own life that echo hers, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be named. The lanterns of Eliza Whitlock's house did not just light the way for travelers. They lured them like stars that never moved in the sky. Each glow a silent signal promising warmth, food, and water. But behind the flickering glass of those flames, a second light waited, a light of calculation and hunger, and a history older than the hills themselves. You can almost hear it as a hum under the wind, the sound of footsteps vanishing, and the hush of secrets sealing themselves inside timber walls. Her neighbors whispered about her garden, not because of what grew there, but because of what never did. No matter the season, the soil around her home stayed dark as ash and cold to the touch, as though something beneath fed on every seed, long before it could rise. She spoke softly at church. She donated flour to the poor. She stroked the heads of hungry children. But every act of kindness felt rehearsed, like a mask laid over something hard and gleaming and ancient. The travelers she chose were not random. She selected men carrying debts, secrets or guilt, men who would not be missed quickly, men whose disappearance could be explained away by hunger or drink, or simply the endless distances of the Ozarks roads. She watched them as they drank from her wooden cups, and she listened to their confessions, the way a hunter listens for the breaking of twigs in the forest, and while she poured their water, she measured something else entirely, the weight of their lives against a balance only she could see. The county believed in its own myths of law and order, but Eliza operated beneath those myths, a hidden strata of control where ritual replaced justice, and old whispers overruled written codes, and when the first few men vanished, the sheriff wrote their names in a small book and closed it, never opening it again. The same way a priest might close a forbidden text and slide it back into a locked chest. But every night the e-book grew heavier with names that were never spoken aloud, because to speak them was to admit that the Ozarks itself had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. By the winter of 1912, the pattern had become a pulse. Hidden beneath the quiet rhythm of the Ozarks, men would come through the winding road, vanish near the Whitlock house, and never be seen again. Wagons broken down, hooves clattering in the dark, a lantern raised in a window, promising rescue. The script never changed, only the faces did. And in town, a dull fear began to spread like fog. Yet no one dared cross the line from suspicion into accusation. Because Eliza's reach extended further than her porch, she held small debts, favors, and whispered threats like threads tying the county to her hand. She had learned the old systems of power from a grandmother, who came from the lowlands of Europe, carrying with her not only herbs and charms, but an entire philosophy that sacrifice bends reality. This is not the kind of sacrifice spoken of in churches on Sunday. This is the black economy of life, traded for influence, blood for luck, silence for safety. Eliza wore it like a second skin, and in the Ozarks she found a perfect stage remote fractured lawless in its valleys, where men disappeared into mines or moonshine stills and never returned. Each traveler who drank her water left behind something invisible more than coins or stories. They left a piece of themselves that she gathered like a collector building an invisible archive in her hidden room. Under the floorboards, candles flickered around bowls of water that reflected not the ceiling, but the faces of the missing men. And above it all, hung a crude map of the county marked with sigils no court clerk would recognize. When you listen now, you may feel the echo of that map in your own mind. Every town, every name a dot, connected by lines of unseen power. Those lines still run beneath modern roads. They feed institutions, corporations, and quiet rooms where decisions are made without you ever knowing. Halfway down this path, you will be asked to mark your C. Left to comment a phrase twice, a small ritual of recognition that you have crossed from mere listening into initiation. But for now, stay with me as we push deeper into the Whitlock labyrinth where hospitality becomes a weapon and kindness becomes a key to the oldest prison of all. Snow fell heavy on the ridges and valleys that winter, and the Whitlock house seemed to glow through the storm like a beacon. But the warmth it offered was only a thin veil over a colder truth. The few who escaped her threshold spoke of a silence so deep it felt like the house itself was listening. As they sat at her table, her eyes fixed on them with the stillness of a predator waiting for the precise moment to strike, they would later wake outside in the woods, with no memory of how they left, or what they had eaten or drunk. Only the taste of iron on their tongues, and a sensation of being marked. Beneath the floorboards of the back room stood a basin of black water, fed by a spring. No map recorded, and into that basin, Eliza whispered names like incantations. She believed each name bound her closer to forces that could shape the future and break the will of any who opposed her. She was not merely taking lives, she was harvesting willpower, bending the unseen current of men's minds toward her hidden intent, and though she spoke softly, her power radiated like heat from a furnace. The sheriff knew more than he admitted. Each night he burned papers in his stove, papers taken from missing person notices and witness statements from travelers, too afraid to testify, and yet he never touched the Whitlock house because his own brother had once accepted her help and owed her a debt he could never repay. Debts were the true chains here, not the iron of handcuffs, but the invisible links of obligation, guilt, and fear. By early spring, new rumors rose in the hills about strange lights moving through the woods behind her property, faint chants in languages no one could place, and livestock found dead with no tracks around them. These were the outer ripples of the ritual at the center of which sat Eliza Whitlock, calm and methodical, drawing on a tradition of control that predated the courthouse, the church, and even the flag flying over them all, and every traveler who entered her door without suspicion became another stone laid in the unseen foundation she was building beneath the Missouri Ozarks. As the thaw came and the streams of the Ozarks swelled with snowmelt, the whispers around Eliza Whitlock hardened into quiet dread. Yet even then the county kept its distance, because in every era there are people who hold power behind curtains, and she had mastered that pattern in miniature. She gave loans to families. She held secrets from church elders. She could summon help from distant kin with a single coded letter, and so she stood like a spider in the center of a web that glistened harmlessly in daylight and turned lethal in the dark. What the newspapers never printed is what her closest neighbor saw one dawn while cutting wood. A procession of men hooded and silent carrying crates into the Whitlock cellar under the cover of fog, not a single sound, but the crunch of boots on frost. The neighbor moved away within a week, leaving his farm to rot, because he said the trees around it had begun to lean toward her property, as if drawn by some invisible weight. Inside that cellar, Eliza arranged her offerings, not like trophies but like instruments. Each object belonged to a man who had passed through and never left a pocket watch, a military medal, a prayer book with the name erased. She believed these held fragments of their owners, the way hair or blood might, and she used them to weave her intentions, like knots binding the future. Each knot, a command. Each command, a quiet theft of someone else's destiny. And yet even in her perfection, cracks appeared. One surviving traveler wrote in a hidden journal that he had seen her draw a map in ash on the table while whispering to a basin of water, and that map matched exactly the new railway lines being planned by men in the state capital. Men who had never met her, but whose decisions somehow bent to her advantage. Here the story begins to widen beyond one farmhouse into the realm of influence manipulation and the subtle power to steer institutions, without ever stepping into their halls. And as you hear this, you begin to feel how a single life can act as a lever, moving the structures that claim to govern us. By midsummer of 1912, the Ozark Hills steamed with heat and tension, and the Whitlock house took on the look of a temple hidden under the mask of a farmhouse. Travelers spoke of a stillness that deepened as they drew near, like the hush before a storm. The wooden sign offering water and bread, swaying gently in the wind. Yet no bird sang nearby. No insects hummed, as if life itself paused at the boundary of her land. And the deeper truth is that this pause was her power. She created a zone where normal order weakened, and her will filled the vacuum. Local folklore later called her a witch, but that word is too small for what she practiced. She was an operator of systems, old systems of exchange and compulsion that stretch back to the first villages on this continent and far across the ocean. She learned to mix kindness with obligation, secrecy with hospitality, and to use ritual as a form of psychological leverage. Each gesture a signal, each cup of water a binding agreement signed not on paper, but in the nervous system of her guest. She began to expand her reach without leaving her property by selecting travelers who carried messages and contracts. Men whose choices rippled outward into banks, courts, and rail companies. When they disappeared at her table, their decisions changed, and their power leaked into her keeping, like a current diverted into a hidden reservoir. The ledgers she kept did not list names as much as intentions, and once an intention was captured, she bent it to her use, and the county shifted accordingly, without knowing why. The first investigator brave enough to step across her porch was a young deputy named Wardell, who believed the missing men were victims of bandits. He never returned. The only trace of him, a tarnished badge found months later embedded in the mud of a creek downstream from her property. No body, no witness, only an object carrying the echo of his oath and the somme. L of iron, and this disappearance whispered through the towns like a warning, more effective than any threat, because it showed that even the instruments of law could be absorbed into her silence. By the autumn of 1912, the road past the Whitlock land grew emptier than ever, and even the most stubborn peddlers began to circle wide around the rocky bend, where her fence leaned under its own weight. Her influence spread not with noise, but with an absence of noise, like a fog of forgetting that drifted from her porch into the valleys below. Catherine Crawford returned once more from Springfield, walking the last mile on foot, because no driver would take her closer. She described in her journal how the air grew heavier, and the trees leaned inward, as if listening. She found the house sealed tight, shutters drawn, a single candle burning in the upper window. She knocked, and no one answered. Yet she heard the creak of footsteps above, and a faint murmuring like a prayer, or a lullaby sung to someone unseen. Neighbors later said. Catherine emerged pale and trembling and refused to speak of what she had witnessed, only that she left a small parcel of food and children's clothes on the gatepost, and walked away without looking back. Her entry for that day reads simply, "I feel her near, but I cannot reach her, and I fear the cost of trying again inside the house." Thomas sat at the table, his hands folded as if in church, while the children played silently on the floor. He had begun to keep a ledger of his own, mirroring hers, a list of debts, favors, and secrets offered or extracted from travelers who never reached their destination. Each name written in a careful hand, each line underlined with a mark that resembled not a cross but a binding knot. The cellar beneath them had grown deeper, its walls lined with stone and earth dark as a throat. It no longer resembled a root cellar at all, but a chamber prepared for a purpose no one outside could name. And every night the sound of digging echoed faintly through the timbers, carrying upward into the children's dreams. Edward's school records from 1912 show the first signs of a boy unraveling. He sat in class, staring at the floor, tapping his pencil in rhythms. Only he could hear. His handwriting grew jagged. His teacher noted that he often whispered to himself and sometimes seemed to listen to voices beneath the boards when questioned. He would only shake his head and mutter, "Father says it is nothing." Mary, meanwhile, absorbed the story her father wove around them, the story of a mother who had left them. She repeated it in her mind until the imagined abandonment became a shield against the gnawing truth she could not yet name. Her small fingers traced lines in the dirt, imagining her mother far away as she listened to the echoing scraping that sometimes came from below. Even in her earliest drawings, a sense of fear and obsession emerges, stick figures placed over hidden shapes, lines pressed darkly into the paper, figures confined beneath imaginary floors. Children of her age rarely drew such scenes. Yet for Mary these were not fantasies, but fragments of memory, and the way her mind tried to contain a terror too large to voice. Thomas's presence dominated the house, and the landscape beyond every footstep on the porch or sudden shout in the yard reinforced the children's sense that the world was bounded by his rules. The woods around them, the hills, the frozen hollows all seemed extensions of his control, a realm where he dictated what was real and what was forbidden to question. Locals whispered of strange purchases at Forsyth Hardware of barrels of quicklime and other powders unusual for a simple homestead. Yet no one challenged the man who kept to himself and whose reputation for quiet sternness discouraged interference. The winter deepened the silence and amplified the sounds that carried through the valley, the echo of something being buried, a rhythm no one wanted to decipher. Mary's nightmares followed her into adulthood, recurring visions of a woman calling from beneath the floorboards, screams muffled by packed earth, a sound her father had once told her could not be heard yet, lingered in her mind like a warning. She could neither speak nor fully understand. Her husband Richard noticed the patterns, the sudden panic when the basement door creaked, the way she flinched at digging sounds in the garden, the instinctive recoil from enclosed spaces, as if the past itself had imprinted fear into her bones. Richard documented her anxieties in letters to investigators, describing how Mary would avoid basements and underground spaces, refusing to step near them for decades. He wrote of her chronic anxiety attacks, triggered by everyday reminders of the trauma she had buried so deeply. He described a loving woman, somehow absent a part of her, forever trapped in the shadowed valley of her childhood, where a father's violence had dictated the story of her life. Psychologists reviewing her childhood drawings decades later found unmistakable evidence of trauma. The repeated motifs of buried figures, the weight of heavy lines representing the ground, the small female figure beneath the floorboards, suggested a young mind grappling with a horrific reality. Mitchell wrote that Mary had internalized the event as a persistent memory, not fantasy, the images emerging over and over, revealing what words could not convey. The children's isolation mirrored the physical isolation of the homestead, surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes, the nearest neighbor invisible through the hollows. The sound of digging carried farther than one would expect, creating ghostly echoes that no adult explained. The natural acoustics of the valley amplified the dread and uncertainty surrounding the Whitlock home, a place where cries might vanish into limestone and shadow without intervention. Edward's school records revealed a boy changed by events he could not fully comprehend. Declining grades, sudden behavioral outbursts, moments of dissociation when he seemed to listen to sounds others could not hear, his teacher noting episodes that today might be recognized as post-traumatic stress. His mind haunted by echoes of his mother's fate, a child forced to navigate a home transformed into a prison by his father's paranoia. Mary responded differently from her brother, her younger age allowing a degree of psychological compartmentalization. She accepted the story her father told her, while the truth lingered in her unconscious mind, emerging only through drawings she could not explain. Her creativity became a vessel for memory. She could not speak the silence of the household, shaping her perceptions, her fears, her very sense of safety. The trauma extended across generations. Robert Coleman, Mary's eldest son, decades later uncovered his mother's hidden childhood drawings in the attic, drawings of floorboards and buried figures that revealed a child's awareness of horror. that had been unspoken for nearly 40 years. He visited the former Whitlock property, now a hunting lodge standing where the original house had been demolished. Feeling the sorrow of a truth never spoken, the weight of a family secret preserved in art, in nightmares, in silence. Mary's adult life reflected the enduring impact of her childhood trauma, chronic anxiety, phobias triggered by enclosed spaces or the sound of digging, emotional detachment from her surroundings. Richard Coleman described his wife as loving, but somehow absent a part of her, forever trapped in the hidden valley of the Ozarks. Her mind split to protect her from unbearable memories, a survival mechanism allowing function while hiding the past. Her parenting mirrored the caution and fear instilled by her father. She monitored her children closely, imposed strict rules about basements and digging in the yard, and reacted with intense anxiety when separated from them. Robert Coleman later realized these measures were connected to his mother's own buried experiences, a reflection of inherited trauma, passed down silently from one generation to the next. The community's response to the Whitlock case reflected broader social patterns in early 20th century rural America. Domestic violence was considered a private matter, and mental illness was poorly understood. Neighbors noticed Thomas's increasing isolation and agitation, but interpreted these signs through cultural norms that valued male authority and family privacy. Sheriff Harmon had limited grounds for investigation and lacked the legal or social support to challenge Thomas's narrative. Even Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, faced obstacles with no legal standing to demand access to her niece and nephew, or compel authorities to act. Her frustrations, recorded in her journal, reveal the constraints placed on women attempting to seek justice. Dr. Elaine Foster, a criminologist who studied rural homicide patterns in 1980, noted that the Ozarks' isolation created conditions for what she called invisible crimes, acts of violence that remained undiscovered due to geography and culture. In urban settings, disappearances would be noticed and questioned, but in remote regions like the Ozarks, a person could vanish with minimal social disruption, especially women whose identities were tied to their husbands. Foster argued that the 40-year delay in discovering Eliza's fate was not just investigative failure, but systemic blindness to domestic violence. Thomas Whitlock's story that his wife had abandoned the family was readily accepted because it fit existing narratives about women and frontier life. The alternative explanation that he had murdered her was disturbing and legally difficult to address. It was simpler for all to accept abandonment. The physical environment of the Ozarks played a crucial role in both the crime and its concealment. The rugged terrain with deep hollows, dense forests, and limestone caves provided natural hiding places. During Prohibition, these features facilitated moonshining. In the Whitlock case, the isolated homestead, in a narrow valley surrounded by steep hills, ensured unusual activities would go unnoticed. The harsh winter of 1911 to 1912, with heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures, further reduced the chance of visitors who might witness suspicious behavior. Professor Matthews noted that the limestone-rich soil of the region inadvertently preserved evidence. The alkaline composition and dry conditions inside the collapsed root cellar preserved Eliza's diary, and partially her remains, allowing identification decades later. The discovery of Eliza's diary in 1952 by Walter and Ruth Simmons became the catalyst for reopening the case. The diary provided a window into her final months, revealing her growing fear, isolation, and concern for her children. The entries described Thomas Whitlock's increasing paranoia and controlling behavior, along with the tense atmosphere at the homestead. Neighbors' recollections and old purchase records of quicklime combined with the diary created a clearer picture of the events that had been obscured for decades. The investigation confirmed that Thomas had murdered Eliza and concealed her body in the root cellar, while maintaining a narrative of abandonment that fooled the community for 40 years. Mary Whitlock's life after the events remained shaped by the trauma she had witnessed. Her childhood drawings, discovered decades later, revealed recurring images of a small female figure beneath floorboards, or earth with stick figures above, capturing the buried truth her father had forced her to keep. Dr. Eleanor Mitchell analyzed these drawings, noting patterns typical of children who had experienced severe trauma, including repetition of disturbing themes heavy pressure in certain lines, and placement of figures in constrained positions, Mitchell concluded that Mary had been aware of her mother's fate, and that the images reflected persistent memories rather than fleeting imagination. Her adult life continued to show signs of unresolved trauma, including chronic anxiety phobias related to enclosed spaces and emotional detachment from certain experiences. Robert Coleman, Mary's eldest son, visited the former Whitlock property in 1968, by which time the original house had been replaced with a hunting lodge. Standing on the ground, he described feeling profound sorrow, not only for the grandmother he never knew, but for his mother who carried the burden of hidden truth throughout her life. He reflected that some secrets refused to remain hidden, no matter how deeply buried, and recognized that his mother's strict rules and anxious protection of her children were connected to her own traumatic past. Robert's observations highlighted the intergenerational impact of trauma, showing how isolation and silence can extend the effects of violence across decades and shape the behaviors and fears of subsequent generations. The Whitlock case remains a stark reminder of how isolation, secrecy, and cultural norms can enable abuse to flourish unchecked. The deep hollows of the Ozarks, the rugged terrain, and the social expectation of non-interference created conditions in which Thomas Whitlock could commit murder and maintain a false narrative for decades. The psychological scars borne by his children, particularly Mary, illustrate the long-lasting impact of trauma and the coping mechanisms developed to survive it. The eventual discovery of Eliza's remains and Mary's childhood drawings brought a measure of truth to light, revealing the hidden horrors of a family tragedy and the resilience of memory. The story of Eliza Whitlock serves as a chilling testament to the dangers that can lurk within seemingly ordinary lives and the enduring power of buried secrets.